Hi everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of The European Angle. I'm Miles.
And I'm Raphael. We're both still in high school, but we share a real passion for European politics, economics, and the questions that shape the future of our continent.
Our goal with this podcast is to make these big, complex topics more accessible, especially for younger people like us. We want to bridge the gap between the classroom and the real world, and between decisions made in Brussels or Bern, and how they affect our everyday lives.
Every episode, we'll be speaking with scholars, experts, or people working in the field to break down what's going on and why it matters.
Today's topic is one that really cuts into the heart of Europe's current struggles. How can Europe achieve greater strategic independence and internal unity in the face of shifting global power distribution, internal political fragmentations, as well as external threats such as the war in Ukraine?
We'll be looking at how Europe should position itself in a time of rapidly changing power distribution, Europe's reliance on the United States, and internal disagreement over values, and also how the rise of populism and nationalism are testing the limits of European unity and what this might mean for the future of the European project.
To help us make sense of all this, we'll be talking to Professor Stefanie Walter, who is a full professor for international relations and political economy at the Department of Political Science at the University of Zurich.
It's not an easy conversation, but it's one worth having. So let's get into it.
Is there a lack of unity in Europe or the European Union, especially now that the EU can't necessarily count on the United States for help, especially military help?
Well, I mean, the EU, of course, so one thing is, we talk about Europe and now we talk about the European Union. Let's start with the European Union first. The European Union is an amazing thing in a way because it has 27 countries that are working together in an institutionalized form, have sort of pooled some of the sovereignty in a variety of issue areas. But of course, they're still individual countries and also retain a lot of sovereignty, right? So, on the one hand, the EU always has this tension that on the one hand, you want it, or many people want it to be able to act forcefully, especially with the other countries that, don't have that complicated structure and can act much faster. And at the same time, you want it to be democratic and, cognizant of all countries' sovereignty and not impinge too much on these countries. And these two goals, they are in tension. And I think that's something that the EU constantly struggles with. But, and it's a problem that it has, but it also has a strength, right? So, because if the EU just did what like a normal government does and just like decided by themselves without consulting with the different countries, not giving the different countries that would really mean that the sovereignty of these countries had been diminished quite substantially. What the EU has is an institutionalized process where the member states really get involved and they talk a lot. And you can see that the ability of the EU to act really varies across issue areas. And that's because some issue areas in the EU are much more integrated than others. So trade policy, for example, is an area, or probably the area, where the member states haven't given most authority to the EU, right? And the EU sets the union's tariffs and everything, and it still consults with the member states, but it's really the Commission in trade policy that drives things. And here, that's also why the Commission is negotiating with the US, for example, at the very point. And here it can be forceful. EU has already prepared these countermeasures, even though it tries to get everybody on board. And that is also why we do see that trade policy, even trade policy, where the EU has so much decision-making power, it sometimes wobbles because it wants to get people on board. And then the French are worried about cognac, and then the Germans are worried about cars. And, then so that's why it's always a bit, difficult. There are other areas, such as security, where that are so central to member states' sovereignty, that the sovereignty stays mostly with the member states, and they have transferred very little. At the same time, it's very clear that if you're confronting big countries like Russia, you need to stand together. And sort of the diversity in weapon systems and the lack of coordination that we're seeing in Europe is not conducive to a very efficient and also effective defense, right? So I think what we're seeing here is that the withdrawal of the U.S. and the challenge of the U.S. that we've seen now in the second Trump administration have really served as a wake-up call and have really made clear to the Europeans that there's a real threat, and that has really jump-started them into action. And I think we're seeing much more than we would have probably have thought possible a year ago. The question still is that enough, right? But I think in a way it is a problem that the EU is not acting more coherently. Yet at the same time, I think if it did, then there would also be a risk that Euroscepticism would rise even more. That perhaps some countries would want to get out because they wouldn't want to be part of this. So I think, I think people always say that the default policy action of the way the EU functions is muddling through, and I think that's very true. But I actually think it's by design.
You mentioned the jumpstart.
Yeah.
Do you feel like this will also bring more union and cohesion within this European Union, because they now feel like the situation with America has become more unstable, and therefore they're more self-reliant?
I think on the one hand, yes, and on the other, no. And the reason is, so I think it's always good to have an external enemy because it unites internally, right? It's called the rally around the flag effect. And that is something that is well documented. So I think in that sense, I think it helps. And sort of, I think you can already see like people were outraged by, the comments that U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance made in Munich and everything. So I think that is drawing people together. And I think it's also highlighting the need to act together. And I think, especially among governments, I think it is highlighting the need to act. At the same time, we shouldn't forget that there's actually quite a lot of people in Europe and even some governments who think that what Trump is doing is just fantastic and we should also be doing it here. And there's also, actors in the U.S., most notably the Heritage Foundation, which is sort of the intellectual brain behind much of what Donald Trump is doing now, that has now set its eyes on Europe and says, well, we have actually ideas because we think the European Union is terrible and it should be reformed and it should be abolished. And there should be a union of sovereign states. And we kind of would like to help push for that. That's this whole values argument that Vance also made. So and of course there are actors in Europe, think of the AfD in Germany, or even, or look, Orban very clearly, but even the Meloni government in Italy, who are not so against these kind of visions. So I think there's also risk that that this can prove quite divisive. And especially so if there's, of course, then a lot of pressure, then, and people think it would be a good idea to start with to change policies, that can become quite a divisive issue. So I think it's, we'll have to wait a little bit to see. I think there are some risks, but I also think that, the need to act and sort of the understanding that we actually do share some values and they're different from the current Trump administration. It's a shock, I think, for Europe, because for a long time Europe has seen itself so aligned with the US. But I think it could, it could bring overall a rally around the flag effect. But, as I said, I think there's also some risk that there could be serious tensions.
Do you also see a reward or a potentially better outcome than we have experienced in the past years due to this drastic change in American administration?
No, actually, I think we're in a world where there's not much upside. I think I think that there is a lot of research that demonstrate that countries cooperating is really a better outcome than countries not cooperating. And it's true that, singular countries could be better off if everybody else continues to cooperate and they don't cooperate. That's very, there's many models that show that. It requires the other countries to continue to cooperate. And maybe, so the question is, can you get others to cooperate? And I think that's exactly what the US is trying to do by coercing them and say, look, you better lower your tariffs and we'll increase the tariffs and then we'll just trade on those terms. The question is whether that is sustainable in the long run. Now, given the power differential between the US and the EU, I think Europe, and not just the EU, but also Europe and Switzerland, for example, as well, I think we're on the losing end because the US is the powerful player here, and the US is trying to change the existing relations in a way that is advantageous to them at the cost to Europe. So I actually don't think that there's anything that's better now than it used to be. I think it's a really problematic time for many countries, including Europe.
Do you think the relationship between Europe and the United States will become better once Trump's term has ended? And if yes or if not, what are the reasons for that?
So I think a lot will depend on how the U.S. will look like when Trump's term ends, right? I think a lot of people think, well, when he's gone, everything will be over, and I don't think that's the case. I mean, he's transforming American democracy and American politics in a way that we've not seen before, and it will not be easy to go back to the status quo ante after that. Also, in terms of there's such deep polarization and such deep mistrust. And I think sort of what we're seeing now with even like politicians sometimes being arrested and stuff. So we don't really know where this is going. I think that there's a real risk that that the American system will turn really in an autocratic direction. I also already think I mean, one could debate how democratic it still is. I think. I mean, it's I would say democracy, autocracy. It's a continuum, right? We're certainly not at full autocracy, but I really don't think we're at full democracy anymore either. Especially if you think about things like separation of powers and adherence to the rule of law and these kind of things. So these kind of things are also hard to reintroduce once it's gone, right? So in one scenario, the Democrats win, or like a non-Trump party wins. But then the question is also, given all the experience we have now, will they use the power they have to reestablish a system of checks and balances where you can just, where one party can lose power or not, or will they try to then also retrench and entrench their power, which is also problematic. Or will the Republicans change the electoral system in a way that is that tilts the playing field in a way that there will be elections, but it cannot be won by anyone else. So things like we've seen in Hungary or in Turkey and so on. So I think I really think that America's on a very bad path right now. I really worry a lot about that, and that has implications also, of course, for its external relations, because it's very much preoccupied with itself. And B, Trump is sort of arguing we're like changing the world in a way that we can keep more stuff and that we do better. And in such a polarized setting and a possibly more autocratic setting, then to sort of say, and now we go back to providing public goods to the world, HIV prevention or stability, I know, on a global seas and these kind of things. I think that will be hard to do. So I'm skeptical of how things will develop. I know that's I sound very pessimistic, but I really do think that we are entering a very difficult period of time.
And what would happen to the relationship between Europe and the United States if many European countries would also make this development from a democracy to authoritarian states?
Well, I guess it depends, on what kind of an authoritarian state that would be, and then, I mean, to what extent I think the European authoritarian states then would sort of be willing to sort of play along with Trumpian or like American preferences, right? So I mean, you can be autocratic in many ways. Like autocracy is just like the institutional thing, and then you can have different ideologies attached to that. I mean, you can have Islamic autocracy, you could have like a far right autocracy, you could also have, I think like the Communist Party, you could have a leftist autocracy. So it kind of depends then on who you are, and the question is, would the autocracies that would be emerging here be compatible with the Trumpian type? So if we assume that's the case, something like, we have more Orbans or, the, France, like the Assemblée Nationale wins. And I mean, they are all more in line with kind of like the ideology of the Republican Party right now. Then on the one hand, I think it would be easier because they share some ideas and values, such as, immigration is bad and we need to stop that. At the same time, you can always watch that, the leftists have the international, like the left international where they cooperate. And that's actually easy because they believe there's a common good and that people need to unite and stand together. The nationalist international doesn't work so well because in order to have international cooperation, you always need to compromise. But compromise is exactly the thing that nationalists don't want. They want the best for their own country, and that kind of like often conflicts with compromise, right? So I think that even if everybody became autocratic in Europe, I think it would be a rocky relationship, because I think what the US is demanding is that Europe is doing its bidding. And of course, that's not something that many nationalists think is a great, appealing outcome.
As you mentioned, Europe should become strategically independent. Do you mean that Europe as a continent and the European Union as its major political entity should strive to be more self-sufficient? How does this look, and would that require a more united Europe?
So I think that's what Europe, I mean, I think Europe has not a lot of choice but to become more independent, because it's sort of its big alliance partner for decades. The US is pulling back. So, either you kind of stand there and say, oh, we can't do anything now, or you try to become more independent. So I think that it's not really something they can avoid trying to do. I think the question is, how easy will it be to do that? And we already know that in some areas it will be extremely hard. Like, the nuclear umbrella, for example, is very difficult. Also becoming militarily really self-sufficient will take some time. That said, I think we often also just talk about Europe as, oh, it's like this losing continent. In the global south, people think, oh, yeah, it's a nice place to visit, but really nothing is happening in Europe anymore. And that's also not true, because there's also a lot of innovation going on in Europe. There's a lot of human capital in Europe. There's a vibrant economies. Those are strong economies. I mean, like Russia's economy is the size of Spain's economy. That gives you a sense of like how economically powerful Europe is. Europe is still a leader in trade policy and setting international regulations and so on. So Europe actually has a lot of things going for it as well. And I think it's important to harness these things. And I think in that sense, the pressure is good, because it's becoming much clearer what needs to be done. And another thing that I think is kind of interesting, and I'm not a military expert, but there is some discussion about how the nature of war, for example, is changing. And that typically military planners always like plan for the last war, but not necessarily for the next war. And I think what we're seeing, for example, in Ukraine, is that things like drones and like AI driven weapons and so on are becoming increasingly important. Rather than these necessarily like this big, like, do you need to have like a big, the ships and so on that the US has, right? So, and in drones, for example, Europe is actually not so bad, not least because the Ukrainians are, of course, now really pushing this development. But also Germany has some really innovative weapons companies. And of course, that's not something one thinks is great that, weapons are being produced, but there is some knowledge there in these very modern technologies also in Europe. And I think sort of harnessing this and trying to develop more integrated systems now, I think there are some options. And, I mean, like, I think just like with democracy and autocracy, it's not a 0-1 thing. Like either you have autonomy or you don't have autonomy. There's, it's a continuum. And it's probably hard to really go all the way to autonomy, but can Europe move from being less autonomous to being more autonomous? I think, yes, it can.
How long do you think it might take to make a big step towards this autonomy, to make a very noticeable impact since what we have now?
So, I mean, I think a lot has been happening already. I mean, I think it's quite just like in the last couple of months. I think a lot has happened that we didn't really think was possible. Also, in terms of the joint procurement of weapons and so on. So I think a lot of stuff is actually happening. How long will it take for Europe to become really operational by itself? I find that hard to predict. Also, because I'm not a security policy person. So I'm not. That's not really my expertise. I mean, most things that I've read talk about 5 to 10 years, right? So it's a long period of time. On the other hand, we also know that if it has to happen, it can also happen quickly. I mean, look at the Ukrainian economy and also like weapons production. They had to turn around quite quickly, and they did. And so, I mean, I think we're also talking about the transition in a setting where we don't want to disrupt the economy, where we don't want to disrupt people's welfare, and rightly so. But of course, the question is also like if the context changed dramatically, say because Russia invaded an EU country, I think also the whole set of priorities would suddenly shift. And I think then things would be possible that we would never think. Think of like Russian gas in Germany, which dominated so much. I mean, if somebody had said even 5 years ago, Germany can get off Russian gas in a year and a half, people would have just laughed. and what she said, this will never happen. It's impossible. It cannot happen. And it did. Right. So I think we also, I mean, like, let's hope, of course, that this will not be necessary. But I do think there are situations where some drastic action suddenly becomes possible. And I think the prediction of how long does it take in sort of peaceful times when you have politics as usual versus how long does it take when it really has to happen, I think those are two very, very different predictions. And my prediction would be that if it has to happen because there's urgent need, I think it will happen quicker.
So people like to talk about the EU's bureaucracy. Do you actually think that it's not as bad as people make out to be in that case?
Well, I mean, the EU's bureaucracy, I think, is, I recently read a estimate. I think it's something like as big as the bureaucracy of the city of Berlin or something, right? I mean, it's much, much smaller than any state bureaucracy, right? So it's, people think it's huge, but it actually is not. It's one of these things that people get very hung up about, but it's, I do think that they have many regulations. The interesting thing is that the EU has also recognized this, and they have engaged in quite substantial deregulation, especially in the last couple of months. So they've really rolled back some deregulation to the extent that some people also now say, look, I mean, like, some of these regulations actually have a reason why it's there, so we may want to think about it. And there's always, of course, trade-offs in regulation. So think of the GDPR regulations, the data protection. And of course, it's really annoying to always click away the cookies, right? And I think we can talk about that. But I think, I mean, one could also discuss, is it a good idea that privacy is more protected in the EU than in the US, where everybody can just sell all the data that you have? You are on the web, and whatever you do is, it can be sold to anybody. So, I mean, there are pros and cons, and as always, it's a trade-off. Life is never without trade-offs, but I think the question is getting the balance right. And I think sometimes the EU has overdone it, but I think also some of the regulation. I mean, if you look at the US now, where they are deregulating everything. I'm not sure, that is really the best way forward. I mean, it's kind of nice that we can swim in the rivers here and in the lakes because there is regulation that you cannot, put any chemical in it. So, I mean, I think that the EU has bureaucracy problems, but I think it's also addressing it. And I think it's also something that people really use against it. I mean, the bureaucracy is also really high in some of the countries.
You said in this article that we've read that Ukraine has made Europe more united, and now there is more discussion about a European army and other military collaborations among European countries. But is it really the case that having a strong military is necessary in an era of conflict and uncertainty? And isn't military intervention the opposite of restoring the peaceful European order that has existed since World War II? And are there any other ways than military intervention to restore balance?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I think like a peaceful life together without a military is in any case preferable, right? I mean, I think it's very clear that that not having a military and having peace nonetheless is the best of all worlds. And it's actually something that we've had for the last decades. And I think that's also why it's really, we're reluctant to see that go. Because, of course, if you don't spend on the military, you can actually spend this on welfare, on better education, on climate protection, on all kind of good things, right? And I think it's very clear that that is preferable to a big military. Of course, all of this depends on the assumption that peace will be maintained. Right? And I think for a long time, we rightly assumed that that was just sort of, if we don't fight, they don't fight, and it's all good. I think what we've seen with Ukraine is that that is not necessarily the case. And what we've also seen in Ukraine is that sort of just negotiating doesn't necessarily just solve the problem. Because after 2014, after Russia annexed the Crimea and also some of the Donbass, there was, of course, extensive diplomacy, the whole Minsk process, where there was a lot of negotiations and there was basically a peace process that tried to sort of solve things. And what Russia used this for was essentially to regroup, rearm its military, become strong again, and then go in again. So, I mean, sort of the idea that we can live peacefully and don't need a strong military and don't need, and can just resolve everything by talking requires always that both parties are willing to talk and also willing to then abide by whatever compromise and solution you find. And I think that's the difficult part, that if you have people around you or countries around you that may not be willing to do that. And I mean, don't forget, I mean, Russia already is engaging in a couple of things that people say, essentially, Russia is already at war with Europe, because it is, doing things in the Baltic Sea and so on, and or sabotaging some weapons production, or like those ships in Germany that had these things, where, I think people are trying not to play this up too much, but it's actually quite problematic. So when you have one country, or in these negotiations, when you have one party where you always have to worry that they will come after you, then the only way to really stand up is to be able to say, well, we want to talk, but if you hit me, we hit you back. That is the problem, right? And then sort of the idea of having a strong army is like, if we have a really strong army and can deter, then we don't need it. That's the hope, right? But of course, and I think that's the concern that speaks out of your question, rightly so, is that, when you have two like highly militarized states, there's also a risk of conflict is much higher than if nobody has weapons. But the problem is, if you're one highly militarized country and the others don't, then you have an imbalance that is dangerous for those countries that don't have a military. So I think the wish to have a strong military does not come from the European side, but it is being forced on us basically by the environment, especially from the Russian militarization.
And as you said, collaboration is benefiting both partners. But in the example with Ukraine, Europe bought gas, natural gas from Russia, and Russia used this money to grow its military and now attack Ukraine. Are there any other examples of drawbacks of collaboration between countries?
Well, so the moment you cooperate, you also become more vulnerable, right? So, for example, if the European countries have joined their currency, but of course that then also they have to give up their monetary policy making, or they have a seat at the ECB, but they cannot set their own monetary policy anymore. So there's always trade-offs. And then there's also ways where, so for example, cooperation is great also in terms of trade. We use all these cloud services, and it's actually fantastic. These American tech companies are so savvy and they do all these things so great and so integrated. At the same time, if they ever decided to cut off our cloud, we would really be in trouble. So cooperation generates what we call cooperation gains, right? In this case, like great service, it's cheaper and so on, it runs better, but it also creates vulnerabilities. And there's a whole new research area that has sprung up, which is on the so-called weaponized interdependence. Interdependence is when two countries are dependent on each other, and one country weaponizes that in the sense that it takes the vulnerabilities that emerge from one country to put it under pressure, right? And you can see this with the SWIFT system. The SWIFT system is basically the system that connects all banks worldwide, and basically it's the communication system of banks. And you need SWIFT in order to make transfers. So in order to send money from your bank account to another bank account, this always goes through the SWIFT system. And what the Western countries did, for example, was just exclude all Russian banks from SWIFT, or almost all, because the oil-related countries and gas-related banks, they were still allowed to have some because they needed them. So you can also see some, things there. But basically, I mean, there are vulnerabilities, and you benefit from cooperation, but it always creates some dependencies, and there's always a risk. And I think, for a long time, we assessed many things just based on efficiency and what's like the best price, the best quality. And now security issues and also supply chain disruptions more general have become much more relevant. So people are rethinking some of these things. And it's not just security, it's also things like the pandemic, right? So one of the things that I didn't know, for example, before the pandemic, was that before the pandemic, virtually all running shoes, I don't know if it's all, but like apparently almost all running shoes in the world were manufactured in Vietnam. Just one country. And it's good because they had the expertise and everything, so it made a lot of sense to do it there. But then in the pandemic, when Vietnam had a lockdown, there's just no running shoes worldwide anymore. Nobody's producing them anymore, right? So now companies are thinking about diversifying, say, well, let's have a factory in Vietnam and then maybe another one, I don't know, in Morocco or something. So it's also about non-security risks of sort of diversifying risks. Because of course, when you have these interdependencies, you're always vulnerable. But you also get something in return. That's why you do it.
Why would European democracies struggle to switch to a wartime economy? And how does Russia's political structure allow it, or make it easier for it to begin weaponized conflicts? Is it true to all democracies that they are less likely to start wars? And are periods of conflict also periods of transition from democracy to an authoritarian state?
Oh, that's a lot of questions. Let's start with the first one. Would European democracy struggle to switch to wartime economy, right? Yeah, I think so, because I mean it's painful, right? You use a lot of funds that you used for good things, like schools, like healthcare, like welfare system, like I don't know, and suddenly that has to go to the wartime economy, and that's not fun. That's not nice. We've also been used to living very comfortably, and that is not appealing, right? But the question is not, I mean, people then often compare it to, well, before it was much better. Now we have to go to wartime economy. Of course, that's not going to be very appealing. At the same time, the question is always, what are the alternatives? And if the alternative is to go to wartime economy or to be conquered by Russia, if those are the options, they might look differently, right? So it's always the question of what are the choices that you have. And in that sense, I do think that, if it really became very salient and there was a real problem and there was real like invasion and so on, I think that, I mean, there's much more capability to make these changes than you could. It is easier to do in an autocracy. It's very clear. I mean, you look at Russia, you look at North Korea, they can just say, I mean, I don't care, we'll just invest everything we have, like we will just prioritize the economy. And even there is typically a limit. Then the question on whether democracies are less likely to start wars, it's actually I don't think there's research shows that democracies are necessarily less likely to start wars. There's something called the democratic peace, and that's a very robust empirical finding that democracies are much less likely to fight wars against other democracies. But it's not true that democracies are less likely to fight wars against autocracies, for example, right? Or less likely to initiate wars at all. There are some interesting findings. Like democracies tend to be more likely to win wars that they initiate, for example, right? And it's probably because they have their they have to justify it as with their population, and also have some constraints. They probably think more carefully about which wars to enter or not. But it's not true that democracies in general are so that they're very peaceful countries. And our periods of conflicts, periods of transition from democracy to authoritarian states, not always. I mean, it can happen, and you mentioned, for example, Israel. I would say, I mean, the process of autocratization in Israel probably precedes the Gaza war, right? I mean, like Netanyahu, there have been very problematic developments in Israel that started way before. And also, I think sort of Netanyahu is actually using the war to fight off some of the democratic challenges against his way of ruling. Right? So I think he also has there's some very unfortunate incentives involved here that make the situation much more complicated than it would need to be. But if you think about, I mean, the Vietnam War, I mean, that was a war that the U.S., a democracy, fought, and there was a lot of public opposition against that. And then at some point they pulled out again, also because there was opposition. So it's not true that, every war that a country fights leads to autocracy. Or think about, the UK in the Second World War. They fought a war, but they were a democracy before and they were a democracy after.
Do you think Ukraine should be invited to be a member of the European Union? And are there any policies or treaties that have to be adapted to ensure that the EU doesn't become incapable of making decisions if invite Ukraine?
That's also a really difficult question. I mean, I think from a geopolitical and security standpoint, I think it's important that Ukraine enters Europe, also to sort of to create this counterweight against Russia, and also to sort of I mean, like it's now also a very militarized state, and if you create like a state who's very sort of then apprehensive against the EU is also not great. So I think there are good reasons to invite it. On economic and political terms, it's a really complicated and difficult issue, right? Because as you sort of hint at, I mean, already the decision-making structure in the EU is kind of problematic because you often have the veto. The veto is good because it preserves state sovereignty, right? So it's funny because many, like often the EU, and now we return to the very start of this conversation, oftentimes the EU is being criticized for taking away, like, or for being so slow and in decision making, and at the same time for impinging so much on country sovereignty. But those two are connected. If it were if it were quicker, it's like if it took away more sovereignty, then it could be quicker, right? So it's being against both is kind of difficult because it's not clear how you resolve this. But I do think that if Ukraine joins the EU, then there needs to be reform. I think it's not going to be possible, and it doesn't just need political reform, but also some reform of key policy areas, most notably the common agricultural policy, which is the agricultural also redistribution that the EU does, because Ukraine is such a large agricultural economy. And there are predictions that basically all subsidies will go to Ukraine in the current model, right? Because it is on sort of level of development and these kind of things. A lot of current subsidies go to France, for example. So you can imagine how French farmers will react to this, right? Already they're like some of the biggest supporters of the Rassemblement National. They're kind of skeptical against the EU. Now, if the EU also said, and by the way, we're taking all the subsidies and giving it to Ukraine, I think that can also create quite substantial political problems within the union, within the existing member states, right? So it is a really thorny issue. I'm glad that I don't have to decide this because it's really difficult to manage. I think the EU will have to manage it, but it's not easy. It's not easy at all.
Do you see a light at the end of the tunnel?
I mean, it's an era where we have a lot of uncertainty. I've never seen in my life so much uncertainty. I think also where, I can imagine good outcomes, but I can also imagine quite bleak outcomes. So I think but I think it's also important to focus also on the good things and not always to talk things down, and to remember that there are also many things that are going well, and that and to do something. So I think like your podcast, it's a good thing because you're getting people engaged to think about these things. And I think just even understanding that some of these choices are not easy and involve trade-offs, and it's not the case that policymakers don't know that these things can be painful or have bad outcomes. It's just that they weigh these outcomes as less bad than the others, right? And I think sort of helping people understand that it's that we may be transitioning to a different world where we can't just have everything. That is important. So, and I think that's also our role in this case for me, as an academic. But it's also nice that you, as students, kind of like go out and do this, because I think that's something that we can do, and I think we should.
Creating a more united Europe would also involve handing over more sovereignty to Brussels. Should all European countries be part of the EU, or should the EU incorporate more elements of a federation and move away from being a confederation?
So I think the two things actually are two different. I mean, they kind of probably rule each other out, because if the EU had more countries, like especially the reluctant countries, think of Switzerland or the UK, then I think moving more into the direction of a federation is probably impossible, because already for them it's too much, and then moving even more forward, I think is not gonna. I think it's also very difficult to include countries that don't want to be part of the union. I do think that the countries outside of the EU, I mean, there are trade-offs, right? As we so vividly see in the debates here in Switzerland. I mean, I think here the debate, that's what strikes me always, is that people think we can have all the benefits of the EU with all these extra things that we we negotiate. And of course, the status quo in with the bilateral treaties is really popular for a good reason, because it is very good for Switzerland. But it's also clear that for the EU, it's difficult to justify relative to its other member states why they have to play all by all the rules. Well, and then you can be outside and get an even better deal, right? So it really is tricky, and it encourages Eurosceptics throughout. And there's many Eurosceptics politicians that always point to Switzerland. And so there's also trade-offs for the EU, for example, in that. And I think what will probably happen is that the EU will become more flexible, and I think will become more centralized in some policy areas and perhaps more decentralized in others. But I think then also be clearer in sort of either you're in the club, but then you have to play by the rules, or you're out, but then you also don't share in the benefit. So, and that could perhaps vary by issue area, like we have with Schengen, which Schengen, Switzerland is very integrated. I mean, it's fully integrated, but then we also have to, adopt all the rules that they have. And then in others, we're not. And I could see that as a way forward for the EU. But I mean, there's many reform debates going forward, how that could look like. So it's going to be an interesting phase moving forward.
And now populism and radicalization often happen because citizens feel left behind. And couldn't this issue be exacerbated if more and more decisions were made in faraway Brussels and people felt even more disconnected from politicians if more countries were part of the EU and the EU had more capabilities?
Well, again, I think the question is always what's the alternative, right? And I think what populists often tell people is that you can have everything without the trade-offs. So, we talked before about sort of this idea of, being better off if everybody continues to cooperate and you don't cooperate. Right? So, I mean, I think that was a very dominant, for example, narrative in the Brexit debate, where many pro-Brexit politicians said, look, I mean, things are really good. We could just get out of the EU, keep all the good stuff, meaning the EU will continue to cooperate, and then we'll get rid of the stuff that we don't like immigrants, and it will be great. And it's true. Of course, it will be great if everybody continues to give you everything, and then you can just do the things you like, drop the things you dislike. You will be better off, and that's true. And I think that's why it's very appealing to people. But the thing is, of course, this is not how it works, because of course, what the EU said is, well, either in or out, but we're not gonna give you everything. I mean, international cooperation is always built on compromise. And that means that both sides need to make difficult decisions and make compromise, but they also get stuff. So if one side pulls out and says, well, I'm pulling out of the bargain, but you still need to keep yours, that doesn't work, right? So, but the problem is that it always sounds very appealing. But in reality, the trade-offs are much starker, right? So the question is, if we broke up the EU and everything went back to the nation states, would people really be better off? I'm not sure. So I think we can talk about ways to increase and enhance democracy and so on. But of course, the EU also at least has the European Parliament. The problem is that people also don't vote in the European parliamentary elections. So I think there are ways, where you can perhaps try to make it more relevant and explain to people that the Parliament now, ever since the Lisbon reforms, actually has a lot of decision-making power. So use your rights to select people there and so on. Right? So I think it's a bit of a trope to say, oh, it's all in Brussels and we cannot do anything. Because, of course, there's the Parliament, there's the national representatives and so on. But it sounds easy. And I mean, I think that's something that populists are very good at, both sort of in terms of the substance that they suggest, but also actually there's research that shows in terms of speaking, they just make it sound so easy when it's not, right? But it's also a problem when they come into office. There's lots of evidence that shows that when populists come into office, then, in the long run, like growth goes down, unemployment goes up, because it turns out things are not so easy to fix as they often claim.
So thank you very much for being part of this conversation and taking your time to speak for this podcast. Your insights really helped us understand the complexities behind these issues, and you gave us a lot to think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. We really appreciate you being part of our conversation. Hope the listeners at home will be equally enriched as we have been today.